The steady beep of the heart monitor was the only sound in room 314 as I watched my husband Richard pack his overnight bag. 3 days after my emergency cardiac surgery, and he was already making excuses to leave. The flowers from my coworkers were wilting on the windowsill, but none had come from the Torres family. Not one. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Phoenix Project meeting can't wait, Richard said without looking at me, stuffing his laptop charger into his briefcase. You understand, right, Amanda? Dad's counting on me to close this deal. I understood more than he realized. After 8 years of marriage, I'd learned that Torres Construction always came first. My heart attack at 34 had been inconvenient. Timing, happening just weeks before their biggest commercial development project was set to break ground. The chest pain had started during our anniversary dinner at the Copper Crown, Phoenix's most exclusive restaurant. Richard had been distracted all evening, constantly checking his phone while I tried to celebrate 8 years of what I'd thought was a solid marriage. When I collapsed in the parking lot, gasping for air as sharp pain radiated down my left arm, Richard's first concern wasn't getting me to the hospital. It was whether the valet had seen me fall. "This is embarrassing, Amanda," he'd whispered, as the paramedics loaded me into the ambulance. "Can you try to keep it together until we get to the hospital?" St. Mary's Medical Center became my world for the next week. The cardiac wing felt like a prison, all beige walls and antiseptic smells, but at least it was honest about what it was. Dr. Catherine Sullivan, my cardiologist, had been direct about my condition. A massive heart attack caused by stress and an undiagnosed genetic condition that had been silently building pressure in my arteries for years. "You're lucky to be alive," she'd told me after the emergency surgery to insert 3 stents. "Your heart was working at about 30% capacity. How long have you been experiencing chest pain and shortness of breath?" The answer was months, maybe longer. I'd attributed the exhaustion to working 60-hour weeks at Morrison Marketing, while also managing the household, the social obligations that came with being married to Richard Torres, and the constant stress of never quite measuring up to his family's expectations. The Torres clan had built their construction empire over 3 generations, and they never let anyone forget it. Victoria Torres, my mother-in-law, had made her opinion of me clear from our first meeting. I was the girl from Denver who'd met her son at a business conference, someone without the proper Phoenix connections or the right kind of family background. My parents were middle-class educators who'd saved every penny to send me to Arizona State University, where I'd earned my marketing degree while working 2 part-time jobs. That practical background apparently didn't translate into Torres family approval. "She's not one of us," I'd overheard Victoria telling Richard's sister Patricia during our engagement party. "Mark my words, she'll never understand the pressures of running a family business." The irony was bitter. I'd spent years trying to prove myself worthy of the Torres name, organizing their charity events, entertaining their business clients, and quietly supporting Richard's career advancement. Within the family company, when Morrison Marketing had offered me a promotion to senior account executive last year, I'd turned it down because Richard said it would interfere with my duties as a Torres wife. Now, lying in this hospital bed with my chest cracked open and rebuilt, I was finally seeing clearly. The stress that had nearly killed me wasn't just from overwork. It was from constantly shrinking myself to fit into a family that had never intended to accept me anyway. Richard finished packing and moved toward the door, pausing only to glance back at me with what might have been guilt or impatience. "Mom and Patricia will check on you tomorrow. Brandon's handling the Henderson account, so he might stop by too." "What about you?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. "I'll be back Sunday evening," he said, already mentally elsewhere. "The doctor said you're stable now, right? You don't really need me here." The casual dismissal hit harder than the heart attack had. After 8 years of marriage, My husband was treating my near-death experience like a minor inconvenience that was disrupting his work schedule. I watched him walk out of room 314 without looking back, the sound of his expensive leather shoes clicking down the polished hospital corridor until they faded completely. Alone with the beeping monitors and the steady drip of medications, I began to understand that this abandonment wasn't sudden. It had been building for years, hidden behind social obligations and family dinners, and the comfortable routine of a marriage that had stopped being a partnership long ago. The next morning brought Dr. Sullivan with my discharge paperwork and a stern lecture about lifestyle changes. "Mrs. Torres, you need to eliminate stress from your life. This isn't a suggestion, it's a prescription. Another episode like this could be fatal." She handed me a thick folder of recovery instructions, medication schedules, and follow-up appointments. "You'll need someone to monitor your condition for at least the first month. Family support is crucial during cardiac recovery." I almost laughed at the irony. Family support from the Torres clan meant occasional check-ins to ensure I wasn't creating any inconvenience for their business operations. Victoria's idea of care was sending her housekeeper to drop off meals, while Patricia's support consisted of reminding me not to mention my health problems at social events because it made people uncomfortable. "I'll manage," I told Dr. Sullivan, though I wasn't sure how. That afternoon, Lisa Park, the nurse who'd been checking on me throughout my stay, knocked softly on my door. Unlike the Torres family, Lisa had actually seemed concerned about my well-being. She'd stayed late on her shifts to make sure I was comfortable, brought me extra pillows, and even shared stories about her own family to keep my spirits up during the long, lonely hours. "Mrs. Torres," she said, settling into the chair beside my bed, "I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but I overheard something yesterday that I think you should know about." My heart rate picked up slightly, though whether from curiosity or dread, I couldn't tell. "What kind of something?" Lisa glanced toward the door, then leaned in closer. "Your husband was here yesterday morning, early, before you woke up. He wasn't alone. There was an older man with him, well-dressed, carrying a briefcase. They were talking in the hallway outside your room." "What were they talking about?" "I couldn't hear everything, but I caught enough to be concerned. Something about papers that needed to be signed while you were still hospitalized, and how it would be easier to handle certain matters while you were, quote, not thinking clearly from the medications." The implications sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the hospital's aggressive air conditioning. Richard had been unusually insistent that I sign various documents during my stay, claiming they were related to insurance paperwork and medical authorization forms. I'd been too weak and medicated to examine them carefully, trusting that my husband was handling necessary administrative details. "Lisa," I said carefully, "do you remember anything else about this conversation?" She nodded reluctantly. "The man with the briefcase mentioned something about power of attorney and business assets. And Mrs. Torres, your husband said something about timing being important because of some kind of project deadline." My mind began racing despite the lingering effects of pain medication. Power of attorney documents would give Richard complete control over my financial affairs and medical decisions. Combined with his family's tendency to prioritize business interests over personal relationships, this could mean I'd signed away more than just authorization for medical treatment. "There's something else," Lisa continued. "I saw the man leave. One of the documents on the nurse's station counter. It had letterhead from Hartwell and Associates. I recognized the name because they handle legal work for several of the big construction companies in Phoenix. Dr. James Hartwell was the Torres family attorney, the man who'd handled their corporate legal matters for over 20 years. If he was involved in whatever Richard had been planning, it meant this went far beyond simple medical paperwork. That evening, after Lisa's shift ended, I found myself staring at the ceiling tiles, trying to piece together the fragments of information I'd gathered. The Torres family had always operated as a business first, family second. Richard's sudden absence after my heart attack, combined with mysterious legal documents and urgent business meetings, suggested a pattern I was only beginning to recognize. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "Meeting running late. Won't make it back tonight. Mom will pick you up tomorrow for discharge. Take care." The casual tone, the lack of concern for my well-being, the assumption that his mother would handle what should have been his responsibility, it all crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. Richard wasn't just neglecting me during my recovery. He was actively working around my incapacity, using my vulnerable state to accomplish something that required my signature, but not my understanding. I reached for the call button and summoned Lisa back to my room. When she arrived, I was sitting up straighter than I had since the surgery, despite the discomfort it caused. "Lisa, I need a favor. Could you help me get copies of any documents I signed while I was here? I want to review everything before I'm discharged tomorrow." She looked concerned, but nodded. "I can try. The administrative office keeps copies of all patient paperwork. It might take some time to gather everything, but I can probably get them for you by morning." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Thank you. And Lisa, please don't mention this to anyone who might visit tomorrow. I want to understand what I've signed before I discuss it with my family." After she left, I spent the night planning instead of sleeping. Whatever Richard and his family had orchestrated during my hospitalization, they'd made a crucial mistake. They'd assumed that signing the papers was the end of the story, that I would remain the compliant wife who never questioned Torres family decisions. But my heart attack had done more than nearly kill me. It had given me perspective on exactly how expendable I'd become in their calculations. And if they thought a few legal documents would keep me quiet and manageable, they were about to discover they'd seriously miscalculated. The next morning, Lisa arrived with a manila folder containing copies of every document I'd signed during my stay. There were more than I remembered, and several that I didn't remember signing at all. As I reviewed them, my hands began to shake, though whether from medication withdrawal or anger I couldn't tell. Hidden among the standard medical authorization forms were 3 documents that changed everything. A comprehensive power of attorney giving Richard control over all my financial accounts and business interests. A medical directive that placed him in charge of all healthcare decisions, including the right to refuse treatment. And most damaging of all, a document that transferred my 40% ownership stake in Morrison Marketing's Phoenix branch to Torres Construction as collateral for a business loan I'd never agreed to. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Richard hadn't just abandoned me in the hospital. He'd used my incapacity to secure assets that Torres Construction needed for their Phoenix project, essentially stealing my share of the marketing firm I'd helped build while I was unconscious and recovering from surgery. But there was one detail they hadn't anticipated. During my years at Morrison Marketing, I'd learned to read contracts carefully, and I'd developed a network of professional contacts who specialized in business law and corporate negotiations. More importantly, I'd maintained my own separate legal counsel for my marketing business interests, something Richard had never bothered to investigate. As Victoria Torres's Mercedes pulled into the hospital pickup area, I tucked the folder of documents into my discharge bag and prepared for the performance of my life. The Torres family had made their move while they thought I was helpless and naive. Now it was time to show them exactly how wrong they'd been about who they were dealing with. The woman who walked out of St. Mary's Medical Center that morning looked like the same Amanda Torres who had collapsed in the restaurant parking lot 2 weeks earlier. But inside, everything had changed. The heart attack had nearly killed me, but the betrayal I'd discovered had transformed me into someone the Torres family had never met before. Someone who finally understood that in their world, loyalty only flowed one direction, and family was just another word for business opportunity. Someone who had spent 8 years learning their methods, their contacts, and their weaknesses, while they dismissed her as irrelevant. Someone who had just signed the papers that would give her everything she needed to turn their own tactics against them. As I settled into the passenger seat of Victoria's car, I smiled politely and thanked her for the ride home. But inside, I was already planning my next move. The Torres family had played their hand while they thought I was unconscious and vulnerable. They were about to discover that I'd been awake for all of it, and I'd been taking notes. The ride home with Victoria, Torres was a masterclass in passive-aggressive conversation. She spent 20 minutes detailing the inconveniences my hospitalization had caused the family, from rescheduled business dinners to the awkwardness of explaining my absence at the country club. "Richard has been under tremendous pressure," Victoria said, navigating her Mercedes through Phoenix traffic with the same precision she applied to social manipulation. "The Henderson project is worth $12 million to Torres Construction. We simply cannot afford distractions right now." I nodded sympathetically, playing the role of the recovering wife who understood her place in the family hierarchy. "Of course, I wouldn't want to interfere with business." "I'm glad you see it that way," Victoria continued, her tone suggesting she'd expected resistance. "Patricia mentioned that you might be feeling neglected, but I assured her you understood. The bigger picture. Family sacrifices are necessary during crucial business periods. The casual dismissal of my near-death experience as a mere inconvenience was breathtaking, even by Torres family standards. But I kept my expression neutral, filing away every condescending word for future reference. Our house in Paradise Valley looked exactly the same as when the ambulance had taken me away 2 weeks earlier, but I saw it differently now. The sprawling Spanish colonial with its perfectly manicured desert landscaping wasn't a home. It was a stage set designed to project Torres' family success, and I'd been cast as a supporting character in someone else's story. Victoria followed, me inside, ostensibly to help me settle in, but actually to conduct what felt like an inspection. She checked the refrigerator, tutted at the wilted vegetables, and made notes on her phone about which household services needed to be resumed. "I've arranged for Maria to come twice a week for cleaning," she announced, "and the meal delivery service will resume Monday. Richard thought it would be easier than expecting you to cook while you're recovering." The thoughtfulness was touching, except it wasn't thoughtfulness at all. It was management. Victoria was ensuring that my recovery didn't create additional responsibilities for Richard or interfere with his work schedule. After she left, I sat in our living room surrounded by the material evidence of 8 years of marriage. Wedding photos where Richard and I looked genuinely happy. Furniture we'd chosen together during those optimistic early years. Art we'd collected from trips that had felt like adventures rather than obligations. But scattered among these personal memories were clear signs of how thoroughly the Torres family had colonized our life together. Corporate awards with Richard's name prominently displayed, golf tournament trophies from Torres Construction Company events. Even our bookshelves were dominated by real estate development journals and construction industry publications. I'd disappeared into this marriage so completely that I could barely find traces of the woman I'd been before Richard Torres entered my life. The ambitious marketing executive who'd built client relationships across 3 states. The woman who'd negotiated million-dollar advertising contracts and developed innovative campaign strategies that had earned Morrison Marketing its reputation in the Southwest. That evening, I called in sick to Morrison Marketing for the rest of the week, claiming I needed additional recovery time. It wasn't entirely a lie. I did need recovery time, just not from my heart surgery. I needed time to recover my sense of self and figure out exactly what Richard and his family had stolen from me while I was unconscious. My first call was to Nicole Thompson, my college roommate who'd become a successful business consultant in Denver. We'd maintained our friendship despite the distance and my increasing absorption into Torres family obligations. Nicole had visited Phoenix several times over the years, and she'd never bothered to hide her opinion of my marriage. "Amanda, thank God you're okay," Nicole said when I reached her. "I got your message about the heart attack, but I wasn't sure if I should call. You've been so distant lately." The observation stung because it was accurate. I had been distant, not just from Nicole but from all the relationships that predated my marriage. The Torres family required total commitment, leaving little energy for outside friendships. "I need your help," I said directly. "I think Richard and his family used my hospitalization to manipulate me into signing documents I didn't understand. I need someone I trust to help me figure out what I've gotten myself into." Nicole's background in business consulting included experience with corporate law and contract analysis. More importantly, she knew me well enough to recognize when I was being taken advantage of, something I'd apparently lost the ability to see clearly after years of Torres family conditioning. "Send me everything," she said immediately. "Every document, every email, every text message related to your hospitalization and these mysterious papers. I'll review it all and get back to you with an analysis." While I was scanning and organizing documents, my phone rang. Dr. Sullivan's office was calling to schedule my follow-up appointment and discuss my recovery plan. The conversation reminded me that I had allies in unexpected places, people who were genuinely concerned about my well-being, rather than how my condition affected their business interests. "Mrs. Torres," Dr. Sullivan said when I spoke with her directly, "I want to emphasize how important it is that you have strong support during your recovery. Cardiac patients with reliable family assistance have significantly better outcomes than those who try to manage alone." "What if the family support isn't as reliable as it appears?" I asked carefully. There was a pause before she responded. "That's unfortunately more common than people realize. If you're concerned about your support system, we have resources available. Social workers who specialize in helping patients navigate family dynamics during medical recovery." The offer was tempting, but I wasn't ready to involve hospital social services in what was becoming a complex legal and financial situation. Instead, I asked Dr. Sullivan about something that had been nagging at me since Lisa's revelation about the mysterious meeting in the hospital corridor. "Doctor, do you keep records of all visitors during a patient's stay? I'm trying to piece together some details from when I was heavily medicated." "We do maintain visitor logs for security purposes," she confirmed. "If you need that information for legal reasons, you can request it through our medical records department." Legal reasons. The phrase crystallized something I'd been avoiding confronting directly. Whatever Richard and his family had orchestrated wasn't just a family betrayal. It was potentially a legal matter involving fraud, coercion, and possibly criminal misconduct. That afternoon, I drove to Morrison Marketing's Phoenix office for the first time since my heart attack. The familiar environment felt like stepping back into my real life after weeks of Torres family theater. My assistant, Carmen, nearly cried when she saw me walk through the door. "Amanda, we've been so worried. Richard said you were recovering." "Well, but he wouldn't give us any details about when you might be back." The fact that Richard had been controlling information about my condition and recovery timeline shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. Even my professional relationships were being filtered through Torres family management. "I need to review some business documents," I told Carmen. "Specifically, anything related to my ownership stake in the Phoenix branch and any recent legal communications." Carmen looked confused. "What kind of legal communications?" "Anything from Torres Construction or their attorneys. Anything that might reference business partnerships or loan agreements." Her confusion deepened. "Amanda, we haven't had any communications from Torres Construction. Your ownership stake is protected by the partnership agreement you signed when you joined the Phoenix office. Nothing can change that without your explicit written consent and independent legal review." My heart began racing, though this time from adrenaline rather than medical crisis. If Morrison Marketing had no record of any agreement with Torres Construction, then the document I'd signed in the hospital was either fraudulent or part of a scheme I didn't yet understand. I spent the next 2 hours reviewing my Morrison Marketing files, looking for any connection to the documents I'd unknowingly signed. What I found was both reassuring and terrifying. My ownership stake was indeed protected by multiple layers of legal safeguards. But those same safeguards meant that circumventing them would require sophisticated legal manipulation, the kind that suggested serious premeditation. When I returned home that evening, Richard was waiting in the living room with 2 glasses of wine and an expression of concerned husbandly attention that might have fooled me a week earlier. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" he asked, rising to embrace me with what appeared to be genuine affection. "Mom said you seemed tired after the ride home." I accepted the wine and settled beside him on the couch, playing the role of the grateful wife. Much better. It felt good to get out of the house today. "Where did you go?" The question was casual, but I caught the slight tension in his voice. "Just some errands. Banking, pharmacy, nothing exciting." I sipped the wine, noting how Richard relaxed at my mundane explanation. "Good. You need to take it easy for the next few weeks. No stress, no complications. The doctors were very clear about that." The emphasis on avoiding stress and complications felt loaded with meaning beyond medical advice. Richard was managing me, ensuring I remained passive and uninvolved while whatever scheme he'd initiated played out. "Richard," I said carefully, "I've been thinking about those papers I signed in the hospital. Some of them seemed more complex than simple medical authorizations. Maybe I should have our attorney review them to make sure everything is in order." His reaction was subtle but unmistakable. A slight tightening around his eyes, a pause before responding, a shift in his posture that suggested I'd ventured into dangerous territory. "There's no need for that," he said smoothly. "Dr. Hartwell handled everything perfectly. It was all standard documentation related to insurance and medical decision-making. Nothing you haven't seen before." The lie was so confident, so practiced, that I realized this conversation had been rehearsed. Richard had anticipated that I might question the documents and prepared responses designed to discourage further investigation. "Of course," I agreed. "I just want to make sure I understand everything properly. It's all still a bit foggy from the medications." "That's completely normal," Richard assured me, his relief obvious. "The important thing is that you're recovering well, and we can put this whole episode behind us." Putting the episode behind us. As if my heart attack and near-death experience were simply an inconvenient interruption in the Torres family's business plans. The casual dismissal of my mortality was perhaps the most revealing aspect of our entire conversation. Later that night, after Richard had gone to sleep, I received an email from Nicole with her preliminary analysis of the documents I'd sent her. Her findings confirmed my worst suspicions and revealed additional layers of manipulation I hadn't even considered. The power of attorney document was comprehensive and virtually irrevocable, giving Richard control over financial decisions that extended far beyond emergency medical situations. The medical directive contained clauses that would allow him to make end-of-life decisions without consulting my wishes or seeking second opinions. Most damaging of all, the Morrison marketing ownership transfer was structured as collateral for a loan that Torres Construction claimed I had personally guaranteed. But Nicole had found something else, buried in the fine print of the loan agreement. A clause stating that if the borrower defaulted on payments or became incapacitated, the collateral would be permanently transferred to Torres Construction at significantly below market value. Combined with the medical directive giving Richard authority over my healthcare decisions, it created a scenario where my continued incapacitation would be financially beneficial to the Torres family. The implications were chilling. My husband and his family hadn't just taken advantage of my medical crisis. They'd created a legal framework that incentivized keeping me incapacitated, or at least dependent on their management of my affairs. Nicole's email included a recommendation that I seek immediate legal counsel from an attorney who specialized in elder abuse and financial exploitation, even though I didn't fit the typical demographic for such cases. The tactics being used against Me were similar to those employed against vulnerable elderly patients, adapted for a younger victim who'd been temporarily incapacitated. She also recommended that I document everything, maintain copies of all relevant materials, and avoid signing any additional documents without independent legal review. Most importantly, she advised me to be extremely careful about my personal safety, given the financial incentives the Torres family now had for my continued dependence. The next morning, I called Grace Williams, an attorney Nicole had recommended who specialized in complex business litigation and financial fraud cases. Grace's office could see me that afternoon, which suggested that Nicole had already contacted her about the urgency of my situation. Grace Williams operated from a sleek downtown Phoenix office that projected competence and discretion. She was probably in her 50s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of my appearance and demeanor. After reviewing the documents I'd brought, she sat back in her chair with an expression of professional anger. "Mrs. Torres," she said directly, "what's been done to you is sophisticated financial abuse disguised as routine paperwork. The coordination required to execute this scheme suggests it was planned well in advance of your medical crisis." The confirmation of my suspicions was both validating and terrifying. "What are my options?" "Several, but they all depend on how aggressively you want to respond," Grace replied. "We could challenge the documents on grounds of diminished capacity due to medication and medical trauma. We could pursue criminal charges for fraud and exploitation. Or we could negotiate a private resolution that gets you out of these agreements without public legal proceedings." I considered the options carefully. A public legal battle would destroy any remaining facade of Torres family respectability, but it would also expose me to retaliation and potentially years of expensive litigation. A private resolution might be quicker, but could allow them to escape consequences for their actions. "What would you recommend?" I asked. Grace smiled for the first time since I'd entered her office. "Honestly, I think you have more leverage than you realize. The Torres family has built their reputation on being trustworthy business partners. A scandal involving financial exploitation of a family member during a medical crisis would be devastating to their corporate relationships." She pulled out a legal pad and began outlining a strategy. "We document everything, gather additional evidence, and then approach them with a comprehensive demand for restoration of your assets and dissolution of these fraudulent agreements. If they refuse, we proceed with both civil and criminal complaints." "What kind of additional evidence?" "Hospital visitor logs, communications between Torres family members and their attorney, financial records showing how they've benefited from these agreements. We build a case that demonstrates premeditation and coordination." As Grace outlined the investigation process, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The excitement of intellectual challenge, the satisfaction of strategic planning, the confidence that comes from working with competent professionals who respect your intelligence. For 8 years, I'd been treated like a decorative accessory to Richard's career, someone whose opinions were politely acknowledged and then ignored. Now I was working with an attorney who saw me as a client with legitimate grievances and the intelligence to understand complex legal strategies. Grace arranged for a private investigator to begin gathering additional evidence while I maintained the appearance of normal recovery at home. We would meet again in a week to review findings and finalize our approach. Walking out of Grace Williams's office, I felt transformed in a way that had nothing to do with my cardiac surgery. For the first time since my heart attack, I had a sense of purpose and control over my situation. The Torres family had made their move while they thought I was helpless and naive. They were about to discover that their biggest mistake wasn't underestimating my intelligence or my resources. Their biggest mistake was giving me time to recover, plan, and prepare while they celebrated their apparent victory. The woman who'd collapsed in the restaurant parking lot 2 weeks earlier had been the compliant Torres wife, grateful for any attention and willing to accept any explanation. The woman walking through downtown Phoenix that afternoon was Amanda Torres, and she was done being managed by people who'd confused her loyalty with stupidity. The Torres family had played their hand while they thought I was unconscious and vulnerable. Now it was my turn to show them what I'd learned during 8 years of watching their business tactics from the inside. And I'd learned everything. The Torres family's weekly Sunday dinner at Victoria's Paradise Valley estate had been a sacred tradition for the 8 years of my marriage. Richard insisted we attend religiously, treating these gatherings as essential networking opportunities, where business deals were discussed over expensive wine and perfectly prepared meals by Victoria's personal chef. This particular Sunday, exactly 3 weeks after my discharge from St. Mary's Medical Center, I arrived at the imposing Mediterranean-style mansion with a different purpose entirely. Hidden in my purse was a digital recorder, a folder of legal documents, and the quiet confidence that comes from having professional allies who believe in your intelligence. Victoria greeted me at the front door with the same cool politeness she'd maintained throughout our relationship. "Amanda, darling, you look much better. The rest has done you good." The implication that my heart attack had been caused by insufficient rest, rather than the systematic stress of trying to meet impossible Torres family expectations, was typical Victoria. She had a gift for reframing serious issues as personal failings on the part of others. "Thank you," I replied warmly. "I'm feeling stronger every day." The family had already gathered in Victoria's formal living room, a space that resembled a museum display more than a place where actual people might relax. Richard was discussing quarterly projections with his father, while Patricia scrolled through her phone with the bored expression she wore during family gatherings. Brandon, Richard's younger brother, was examining architectural plans spread across the antique coffee table. "Amanda," Richard said, rising to kiss my cheek with the practiced affection he displayed during family events. "How was your week?" "Productive," I answered, accepting a glass of wine from Victoria's housekeeper. "I've been catching up on business, matters that accumulated during my hospitalization." The comment was innocuous enough, but I noticed a slight tension in Richard's posture. He'd been monitoring my activities carefully since my discharge, asking casual questions about my errands and phone calls with the subtle persistence of someone conducting surveillance. "Nothing too stressful, I hope," Victoria interjected. "Dr. Sullivan was very clear about avoiding unnecessary complications during your recovery." It was interesting how quickly Victoria had become an expert on my medical needs, especially since she'd never shown interest in my health before my heart attack became inconvenient for family business plans. "Actually," I said, settling into the conversation, "I've been reviewing some of the paperwork from my hospital stay. There were several documents I signed while I was medicated that I wanted to understand better." The reaction was immediate and revealing. Richard's wine glass paused halfway to his lips. Victoria's expression shifted from polite interest to sharp attention. Even Brandon looked up from his architectural plans. "What kind of paperwork?" Patricia asked, her tone carefully neutral. "Oh, the usual medical authorizations," I replied casually. "But also some business documents that seemed more complex than I remembered. I thought it might be wise to have them reviewed by an attorney, just to make sure everything was handled properly." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but it felt much longer. These were people who'd built their success on controlling information and managing situations to their advantage. The idea that I might seek independent legal advice was clearly something they'd hoped to avoid. "There's really no need for that," Richard said, his voice carrying the gentle authority he used when explaining why my ideas were unnecessary. Dr. Hartwell handled everything perfectly. It was all standard documentation. "I'm sure it was," I agreed. "But since I can't remember signing some of the documents, I'd feel better having my own attorney confirm that everything is in order, just for peace of mind." Victoria set down her wine glass with the precise control that signaled she was transitioning into management mode. "Amanda, dear, I think you may be overthinking this. Medical situations can be confusing, especially when you're dealing with strong medications. It's natural to feel uncertain about details. The condescension was breathtaking, but I'd been expecting it. Victoria's strategy was always to suggest that any concerns I raised were products of my own confusion or emotional instability rather than legitimate issues requiring attention. "You're probably right," I conceded, playing the role of the uncertain patient. But I did notice something interesting when I was organizing my files this week. I reached into my purse and withdrew a single document, placing it on the coffee table where everyone could see it clearly. It was a copy of the Morrison Marketing ownership transfer, with certain clauses highlighted in yellow. This appears to be an agreement transferring my ownership stake in Morrison Marketing to Torres Construction as collateral for a business loan. The interesting thing is, I don't remember agreeing to any loan, and Morrison Marketing has no record of any communications about this arrangement. The document sat on Victoria's antique coffee table like a bomb waiting to explode. Richard's face had gone pale, while Victoria's expression shifted from condescension to calculation. Patricia and Brandon exchanged glances that suggested they'd known more about this scheme than I'd realized. "Let me see that," Victoria said, reaching for the document with the authority of someone accustomed to controlling situations through force of personality. I handed it over willingly. "I'm sure there's a simple explanation. Perhaps Morrison Marketing's records are incomplete, or maybe I signed something I don't remember clearly." Victoria studied the document with the careful attention of someone looking for escape routes rather than clarifications. "This appears to be a standard business agreement. Richard, didn't you mention that Amanda had agreed to help with collateral for the Henderson project?" It was masterfully done. Victoria was creating a narrative where I had agreed to the arrangement, but simply forgotten due to medical trauma. Richard was being given an opportunity to confirm this version of events, establishing a family consensus about what had transpired. "That's right," Richard said, seizing the lifeline his mother had thrown him. "We discussed it before your surgery, Amanda. You were concerned about Torres Construction's cash flow during the Henderson project timeline, and you offered to help with the financing." The lie was delivered with such confidence that I almost admired its audacity. Richard was gambling that my medical situation had created enough confusion that I would accept their version of events rather than trust my own memory. "How thoughtful of me," I said, maintaining my tone of mild confusion. "Though I'm surprised, I would have made such a significant financial commitment without involving my attorney. That doesn't sound like my usual approach to business decisions." The observation hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone in the room knew I'd built my marketing career on careful contract analysis and legal consultation. The idea that I would commit my Morrison Marketing ownership without professional advice was inherently implausible. "You were under a lot of stress," Patricia offered. "The heart attack, the surgery, the recovery timeline. It's understandable that you might not remember all the details clearly." They were coordinating now, building a collective narrative designed to explain away my concerns while maintaining the validity of documents I'd signed under questionable circumstances. It was impressive teamwork, except for one crucial detail they'd overlooked. "You're absolutely right about the stress," I agreed. In fact, I was so concerned about my memory that I asked Morrison Marketing to review their records of any recent business communications, just to help fill in the gaps. I reached into my purse and withdrew a second document, this one bearing Morrison Marketing's official letterhead. They were very helpful. According to their legal department, no such agreement exists in their files, and any transfer of ownership stakes would require their explicit approval as well as independent legal counsel for all parties involved. The Morrison Marketing letter was brief and professional, but it effectively dismantled the Torres family's explanation. If no such agreement existed in Morrison Marketing's records, then the document I'd signed in the hospital was either fraudulent or part of a scheme that circumvented proper business procedures. Victoria's composure cracked slightly. "There must be some administrative delay. Large companies often have complex filing systems that can create temporary confusion. Possibly, I acknowledged. That's why I thought it would be helpful to have everything reviewed by an independent attorney. Someone who could coordinate with both Morrison Marketing and Torres Construction to ensure all the paperwork is properly aligned. The mention of independent legal review caused another ripple of tension around the room. These were people who preferred to handle sensitive matters through their own attorneys and controlled processes, not independent professionals who might ask inconvenient questions. "Amanda," Richard said, his voice taking on the patient tone he used when he thought I was being unreasonable. "I think you're making this more complicated than it needs to be. Why don't we have Dr. Hartwell explain the documents to you directly? He handled everything, and he can clarify any confusion." The suggestion was designed to sound reasonable, while maintaining Torres family control over the narrative. Dr. Hartwell was their attorney, someone who would naturally present their version of events rather than provide independent analysis. "That's a thoughtful offer," I replied. "But actually, I've already scheduled a consultation with Grace Williams at Williams & Associates. She specializes in business law and contract analysis, so she'll be able to provide a fresh perspective on everything." Grace Williams's name had the desired effect. As one of Phoenix's most respected business attorneys, she wasn't someone who could be easily dismissed or managed. More importantly, her reputation for aggressive advocacy meant she would ask exactly the kinds of questions the Torres family hoped to avoid. "When is this consultation scheduled?" Victoria asked, her tone suggesting she was already calculating how to interfere with or influence the process. "Tomorrow morning," I said. "I'm looking forward to getting some clarity on all of this." The family dinner continued for another hour, but the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. Conversations that might normally have flowed naturally now felt forced and artificial. Richard made several attempts to steer discussion toward my recovery and the importance of avoiding stress, while Victoria offered frequent reminders about the complexity of business matters during medical situations. But I also noticed something else. Brandon had remained largely silent during our discussion about the legal documents, and when he did speak, his comments seemed designed to create distance between himself and his family's explanations. Patricia's contributions became increasingly half-hearted, as if she was reconsidering her role in whatever conspiracy had been orchestrated. As we prepared to leave, Victoria pulled me aside with the pretense of maternal concern. "Amanda, dear, I hope you're not letting anxiety about your recovery create unnecessary worries about routine business matters. Sometimes cardiac patients experience heightened suspicion or paranoia as part of their healing process." The suggestion that my concerns were symptoms of mental instability rather than legitimate responses to questionable documentation was a new low, even by Victoria's standards. But it also revealed how desperate they were becoming to discredit my questions before. "I could involve independent professionals." "Thank you for your concern," I replied. "Dr. Sullivan did mention that cardiac patients need to be especially careful about stress and deception during recovery. She emphasized the importance of having trustworthy people around who will be honest about important matters." Victoria's expression tightened at the implied suggestion that the Torres family might not qualify as trustworthy, but she maintained her facade of concerned mother-in-law. The drive home with Richard was conducted in tense silence. He made several attempts to restart our earlier conversation about the legal documents, each time suggesting that I was overreacting to routine paperwork and potentially damaging family relationships through unnecessary suspicion. "Amanda," he said as we pulled into our driveway, "I'm concerned that you're letting fear and confusion drive you toward decisions that could harm our marriage and our family relationships. Maybe we should consider counseling to help you work through the trauma of the heart attack." The suggestion of counseling was particularly manipulative because it implied that my concerns were psychological rather than factual. Richard was trying to reframe legitimate questions about fraudulent documents as symptoms of mental distress requiring therapeutic intervention. "I think that's a wonderful idea," I replied, surprising him with my enthusiasm. "In fact, I think we should both participate in counseling to help us communicate better about important financial decisions. I'd like to understand how we can avoid situations where I sign documents I don't remember or understand." Richard's expression suggested he hadn't expected me to embrace his counseling suggestion, especially not in a way that kept the focus on the questionable documents rather than my psychological state. That night, after Richard had gone to sleep, I reviewed my notes from the evening's conversations. The Torres family's coordinated response to my questions had been revealing in several ways. They'd clearly discussed my potential concerns and prepared explanations, but their strategy relied on convincing me to accept their version of events rather than seeking independent verification. More importantly, their desperation to avoid independent legal review suggested they knew their documents wouldn't survive professional scrutiny. If everything had been handled properly, they would have welcomed attorney involvement as a way to reassure me and resolve my concerns. Instead, they were trying to manage me through a combination of emotional manipulation, medical gaslighting, and social pressure. The tactics were sophisticated, but they were also evidence of consciousness of guilt. I spent the rest of the evening preparing for my meeting with Grace Williams, organizing documents and preparing questions that would help her understand the full scope of what the Torres family had attempted. But I also found myself thinking about the family dynamics I'd observed during dinner. Patricia and Brandon's reactions suggested they might not have been full participants in the scheme, but rather people who'd been informed after the fact and were now being asked to support a narrative they weren't entirely comfortable with. That potential division within the Torres family could be useful if the situation escalated to formal legal proceedings. Victoria's attempt to suggest I was experiencing cardiac-related paranoia was particularly revealing because it indicated she understood the seriousness of the legal exposure they were facing. People don't resort to accusations of mental instability unless they're genuinely worried about the strength of their position. Most importantly, Richard's offer to have Dr. Hartwell explain the documents directly was essentially an admission that there were aspects of those documents that required explanation. If everything had been straightforward medical and insurance paperwork, no explanations would be necessary. As I prepared for bed, I realized that the evening had accomplished exactly what I'd hoped. The Torres family now understood that I wasn't going to accept their explanations without verification, and they knew that independent legal review was imminent. Their response to this pressure would tell me everything I needed to know about their intentions and their vulnerability. The woman who'd attended Torres family dinners for 8 years had always been the accommodating wife, grateful for inclusion and reluctant to challenge family decisions. The woman who would meet with Grace Williams tomorrow morning was Amanda Torres, and she was done being managed by people who'd confused her loyalty with weakness. The Torres family had made their move while they thought I was helpless and grateful. Tomorrow, they would begin to understand exactly how seriously they'd miscalculated both my intelligence and my determination to protect what was mine. Grace Williams' office at 9 Monday morning was a stark contrast to the Torres family's intimidation tactics from the night before. Her conference room overlooked downtown Phoenix, and the morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows felt like hope after weeks of manipulation and gaslighting. "Mrs. Torres," Grace said, settling across from me with a thick file folder. "My investigator worked through the weekend gathering additional information about your situation. What we've discovered goes far beyond simple document fraud." She opened the folder and spread several photographs across the polished conference table. Security camera images from St. Mary's Medical Center showing Richard and Dr. Hartwell entering and leaving my hospital room during times when I was heavily sedated. Timestamps on the photos corresponded exactly with the dates on the fraudulent documents. "These images establish a pattern of access to your room during periods when you were medically incapacitated," Grace explained. "More importantly, hospital. Staff records show that you were administered additional pain medication approximately 30 minutes before each of these documented visits. The implications sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the office air conditioning. You're saying they drugged me before presenting the documents for signature? That's exactly what I'm saying. We also have testimony from Lisa Park, the nurse who initially alerted you to suspicious activity. She's willing to testify that she observed Richard and Dr. Hartwell discussing the importance of timing these visits when you would be least likely to question what you were signing. Grace pulled out another set of documents. But here's where it gets interesting. The private investigator traced the financial trail of the Torres Construction loan that your Morrison Marketing ownership was supposedly securing. That loan doesn't exist. I stared at her, trying to process the full scope of what she was revealing. What do you mean it doesn't exist? Torres Construction never applied for any loan that would require your ownership stake as collateral. The entire document appears to have been created solely to transfer your assets to their control while you were incapacitated. It's not business fraud, Mrs. Torres. It's theft. The methodical precision of their scheme was breathtaking in its audacity. They hadn't just taken advantage of my medical crisis. They'd orchestrated a systematic theft of my assets while I was unconscious and vulnerable, creating fake business justifications to legitimize their actions. There's more, Grace continued, pulling out financial records. Our investigation revealed that Torres Construction has been experiencing significant cash flow problems for the past 6 months. The Henderson project that your husband mentioned is actually in jeopardy because they've been unable to secure proper financing through legitimate channels. She showed me bank statements and credit reports that painted a picture of a construction company teetering on the edge of insolvency. Despite their outward appearance of success, Torres Construction had been burning through reserves and struggling to meet basic operational expenses. Your Morrison Marketing ownership represents approximately $8 million in liquid assets, Grace explained, enough to stabilize their immediate financial crisis and secure the Henderson project financing. But only if they could access those assets without your informed consent or independent legal review. The scope of their desperation was becoming clearer. My heart attack hadn't just provided an opportunity for theft. It had been their salvation from potential bankruptcy, a chance to solve their financial problems using my assets while I was too incapacitated to resist. What about the medical directive and power of attorney documents? I asked. Grace's expression darkened. Those are potentially the most disturbing aspects of this entire scheme. The medical directive contains language that would have allowed Richard to refuse life-sustaining treatment on your behalf, even against your previously expressed wishes. Combined with the financial incentives created by the ownership transfer, it establishes a scenario where your death would be financially beneficial to the Torres family. The room seemed to spin slightly as the full implications hit me. They hadn't just stolen my assets. They'd created legal mechanisms that would have allowed them to let me die if my recovery became inconvenient for their plans. The power of attorney document is equally problematic, Grace continued. It's structured to remain in effect even after your recovery, giving Richard permanent control over your financial affairs. Most legitimate medical power of attorney agreements include automatic revocation clauses when the patient regains capacity. I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the systematic nature of their betrayal. So they were planning to control my assets permanently, not just during my hospitalization. Exactly. And if you had died during your recovery, they would have inherited your Morrison Marketing ownership, while avoiding any scrutiny of how they'd obtained control over your affairs. Grace organized the documents into neat stacks as she outlined our legal options. We have multiple avenues for response: criminal charges for fraud, theft, and potentially attempted murder through the medical directive provisions. Civil litigation to recover your assets and seek damages for their actions. Or we can approach them directly with a comprehensive demand. for restoration of your rights and dissolution of all fraudulent agreements. What would you recommend? Honestly, I think we should give them an opportunity to resolve this privately before pursuing criminal charges. Not because they deserve consideration, but because it might be faster and less traumatic for you than a protracted legal battle. She pulled out a legal pad and began sketching our strategy. We present them with all of our evidence, make it clear that we have testimony from hospital staff and documentation of their financial motives, and give them 48 hours to restore your assets and dissolve the fraudulent agreements. And if they refuse, then we file both criminal and civil complaints simultaneously. The evidence we've gathered would support charges of elder abuse, financial exploitation, fraud, and conspiracy. The medical directive language could potentially support attempted murder charges, though that would be harder to prosecute. Grace outlined the timeline for our demands. My phone began ringing. Richard's name appeared on the screen, and Grace nodded for me to answer while she activated a recording device. "Amanda, where are you?" Richard's voice carried an edge of anxiety I'd rarely heard before. "I stopped by Morrison Marketing, and Carmen said you'd called in sick again today." "I had a doctor's appointment," I replied truthfully. "Just some follow-up tests related to my recovery." "What kind of tests? You didn't mention any appointments yesterday." The possessive monitoring of my activities was becoming increasingly obvious. Richard wasn't asking out of concern for my health. He was conducting surveillance to ensure I wasn't taking actions that might threaten their scheme. "Nothing serious," I assured him. "Just routine cardiac follow-up. Dr. Sullivan wanted to check my medication levels." "Good. I was worried you might be overdoing things. Victoria mentioned that you seemed anxious about some business paperwork yesterday. She's concerned that you might be experiencing some confusion related to your medications." The coordinated message was clear. The Torres family had decided to attribute any questioning of their actions to medication-induced confusion, creating a narrative that would discredit my concerns while avoiding substantive responses to my questions. "Actually," I said, "I'm feeling much clearer about everything today." The appointment helped clarify several things that had been puzzling me. There was a pause before Richard responded. "What kind of things?" "Oh, just some details about the paperwork from my hospitalization. I think I understand the situation. Much better now." Another pause, longer this time. "That's good. Why don't we discuss it over dinner tonight? I can explain anything that's still unclear." The offer to explain things was revealing because it suggested Richard knew there were aspects of the documents that required explanation. If everything had been legitimate, no explanations would be necessary. "I'd appreciate that," I replied. "Actually, I think it would be helpful if we could meet with Dr. Hartwell as well, just to make sure I understand all the legal implications of what I signed." "Let me check his schedule," Richard said quickly. "He's been very busy lately, but I'm sure we can arrange something." After ending the call, Grace reviewed her notes from our conversation. "He's stalling, trying to buy time to prepare their response to your questions." The suggestion about meeting with Dr. Hartwell is particularly telling because it shows they're still trying to control the narrative through their own attorney. "What should I do about tonight's dinner conversation?" "Be careful. They know. You're asking questions, but they don't yet know the extent of what we've discovered. Use the conversation to gather additional information if possible, but don't reveal anything about our investigation." Grace handed me a small recording device. "Document everything they tell you. Their explanations will likely contain additional admissions or inconsistencies we can use if this proceeds to legal action." That afternoon, I returned home to find Victoria's Mercedes in my driveway. She was waiting in my living room with Patricia, both women wearing expressions of concerned family solidarity that immediately put me on guard. "Amanda, dear," Victoria began as I entered the room, "Richard told us about your continued anxiety regarding the hospital paperwork. We thought it might be helpful to discuss this as a family before you involve outside attorneys who might not understand the full context. The presumption that I would discuss my legal concerns with people who had potentially defrauded me was remarkable, but I maintained an expression of polite interest. "We're all concerned about the stress this is causing you," Patricia added, "especially given your cardiac condition. Dr. Sullivan was very clear about avoiding unnecessary complications during your recovery." They were coordinating their approach, using my medical condition as leverage to discourage legal action, while positioning themselves as concerned family members rather than potential criminals. "I appreciate your concern," I replied. "Actually, I'm feeling much better about everything today. My appointment this morning helped clarify several things that had been confusing me." Victoria's expression sharpened. "What kind of appointment?" "Just routine follow-up with my cardiologist. But she helped me understand some of the cognitive effects of my medications during hospitalization. Apparently, it's common for cardiac patients to sign documents they don't fully remember or understand while recovering from surgery." The comment was carefully crafted to suggest I was beginning to accept their narrative about medication-induced confusion while actually laying groundwork for challenging the validity of documents signed under those conditions. "That's exactly what we've been trying to explain," Patricia said with obvious relief. "The heart attack and surgery were traumatic events that affected your memory and judgment. It's completely understandable that you would feel uncertain about decisions made during that period." They were eagerly embracing any explanation that attributed my concerns to medical issues rather than legitimate questions about their conduct. But their enthusiasm for this narrative would work against them if legal proceedings became necessary. Dr. Sullivan also mentioned that documents signed while patients are under the influence of strong pain medications are often considered invalid if they involve significant financial decisions, I added casually. The comment had the desired effect. Victoria's composure faltered slightly, while Patricia's expression showed genuine concern for the first time since she'd arrived. "That's why we use Dr. Hartwell for all the legal documentation," Victoria said quickly. "He's experienced with medical situations and made sure everything was handled properly." "Of course," I agreed. "Though I'm curious about something. Richard mentioned that the Morrison marketing arrangement was related to Torres Construction financing, but I can't find any record of loan applications or business communications about such an arrangement." Victoria and Patricia exchanged glances that confirmed they knew more about the scheme than they'd previously admitted. "Business arrangements can be complex," Victoria said carefully. "Sometimes preliminary discussions happen before formal paperwork is completed." "That makes sense," I replied. "I suppose my confusion stems from the fact that Morrison Marketing has no record of any preliminary discussions either. Their legal department was quite thorough when I asked them to review their files." The admission that I'd involved Morrison Marketing's legal department caused both women to stiffen visibly. They'd assumed I would accept their explanations without independent verification, and the discovery that I'd already begun investigating was clearly unexpected. "Perhaps there was a miscommunication," Patricia suggested weakly. "Possibly. That's why I thought it would be helpful to have an independent attorney review everything. Someone who could coordinate between all the parties and ensure that proper procedures were followed." Victoria stood abruptly, her facade of maternal concern finally cracking. "Amanda, I think you're making this situation much more complicated than it needs to be. Sometimes it's better to trust family rather than involving outsiders who might not have your best interests at heart." The suggestion that independent legal counsel might not have my best interests at heart, while family members who had potentially defrauded me did, was so audacious that I almost laughed. "You're probably right," I conceded. "Family should be able to work these things out without outside interference." Victoria relaxed slightly at my apparent capitulation, but Patricia continued to look troubled. As they prepared to leave, Patricia lingered behind while Victoria walked toward the front door. "Amanda," Patricia said quietly, I want you to know that I never fully understood all the details of what happened during your hospitalization. If there are problems with the paperwork, I hope you'll remember that some of us weren't involved in every decision." The comment was revealing on multiple levels. Patricia was distancing herself from the scheme while implying that other family members had been more directly involved. She was also suggesting that she might be willing to provide information about what had actually transpired if legal proceedings became necessary. "Thank you for saying that," I replied. "I hope we can resolve everything without any family conflicts." After they left, I spent the evening reviewing my notes and preparing for the dinner conversation with Richard. The Torres family's desperation was becoming increasingly obvious, and their coordinated attempts to manage my response suggested they understood the seriousness of their legal exposure. More importantly, Patricia's comment indicated potential divisions within the family that could be exploited if formal legal action became necessary. People who felt they'd been used or manipulated by Victoria and Richard might be willing to provide testimony about the true nature of the scheme. When Richard arrived home that evening, he carried takeout from my favorite restaurant and a bouquet of flowers that felt more like a peace offering than a romantic gesture. "I thought we could have a quiet dinner and talk through any remaining questions you have about the hospital paperwork," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "That sounds perfect," I replied, activating the recording device Grace had given me. As Richard unpacked the takeout containers, I realized that this conversation would determine whether the Torres family chose to resolve this situation privately or force me to pursue criminal charges. Either way, I was finally ready to confront the people who had tried to steal my life while I was fighting for it. The woman who had trusted Richard Torres with her heart and her assets was gone, replaced by someone who understood that loyalty was a two-way street and family was supposed to protect, not prey upon, its most vulnerable members. Tonight, Richard would learn exactly how thoroughly he'd miscalculated both my intelligence and my determination to reclaim what they'd stolen while I was unconscious and defenseless. The dinner conversation with Richard that night was a masterclass in calculated deception. He laid out the Torres family's version of events with the polished confidence of someone who'd rehearsed every detail, explaining how my supposed agreement to help with collateral had been a loving gesture to support the family business during a challenging period. "You were so worried about the Henderson project timeline," Richard said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand with practiced affection. "You insisted that we use your Morrison marketing ownership to secure the financing. I tried to talk you out of it, but you were determined to help." The performance was flawless, complete with emotional touches and references to conversations that had never happened. If I hadn't already seen the evidence of their systematic theft, I might have been impressed by the thoroughness of their fabrication. "That does sound like something I would do," I replied, maintaining the appearance of someone trying to reconstruct lost memories. "Though I'm surprised I wouldn't have consulted my attorney first. That's always been my practice, with significant financial decisions." Richard's explanation for this inconsistency was smoothly delivered. "You said the timing was too critical to involve lawyers. The Henderson project had strict deadlines, and you wanted to help immediately rather than waiting for legal reviews. That might take weeks." As he continued weaving his fiction, I felt a strange sense of detachment. This man I'd loved and trusted for 8 years was lying to my face with such practiced ease that I wondered how many other deceptions I'd accepted without question during our marriage. The recording device in my purse captured every word of his elaborate fraud, but more importantly, it documented his willingness to construct an entirely false narrative rather than admit what he'd actually done while I was unconscious and vulnerable. When I asked about the medical directive and power of attorney documents, Richard's explanations became even more creative. According to his version, I'd specifically requested comprehensive authority for him to make healthcare decisions because I was terrified of being kept alive artificially if my condition deteriorated. "You made me promise to make practical decisions rather than emotional ones," he said with what appeared to be genuine emotion. "You said you trusted me to know what you would want, even if you couldn't communicate it yourself." The manipulation. was breathtaking in its audacity. Richard was not only justifying his theft of my assets, but also his acquisition of life and death authority over my medical care. If Grace Williams hadn't shown me the evidence of their financial motives, I might have found his explanations plausible. But knowing what I now knew about Torres Construction's desperate financial situation and the provisions that would have made my death profitable for them, Richard's words took on a sinister quality that made my skin crawl. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours, with Richard providing detailed explanations for every questionable aspect of the documents I'd supposedly signed. His version of events was internally consistent and emotionally compelling, the product of careful planning and coordination with his family. As we cleaned up after dinner, Richard seemed satisfied that he'd successfully managed my concerns. His relief was obvious as he discussed plans for the upcoming weekend and mentioned that his father wanted to schedule a family meeting to welcome me back into active participation in Torres' business decisions. That night, after Richard had gone to sleep, I listened to the recording of our conversation while reviewing the evidence Grace Williams had assembled. The contrast between Richard's fiction and the documented reality of their scheme was stark and damning. The next morning, I called Grace to schedule our final meeting before confronting the Torres family with our ultimatum. But when I arrived at her office, I found her examining a new stack of documents that had arrived overnight. "Mrs. Torres," Grace said, her expression grim, "we have a problem. Dr. Hartwell has filed a petition with the court requesting a competency hearing for you, claiming that your recent behavior suggests cognitive impairment related to your cardiac medications." The legal maneuver was sophisticated and vicious. By questioning my mental competency, the Torres family was attempting to invalidate any legal action I might take, while simultaneously justifying their control over my affairs through the fraudulent power of attorney. They're also requesting emergency injunctive relief to prevent you from making any financial decisions until the competency hearing can be completed, Grace continued. If granted, it would freeze your assets and prevent you from challenging their control. The timing of this legal attack, coming immediately after my dinner conversation with Richard, suggested they'd been planning this strategy as soon as they realized I wasn't going to accept their explanations without question. "What are our options?" I asked. "We respond aggressively and immediately," Grace replied. "I'm filing an emergency counter motion this morning, requesting an expedited hearing and presenting all of our evidence about their fraud and financial manipulation. We're also filing criminal complaints today, rather than waiting for their response to our private demands." She organized her files with military precision. The competency petition actually works in our favor because it demonstrates consciousness of guilt. Innocent people don't try to have their accusers declared mentally incompetent. Within hours, Grace had filed a comprehensive legal response that turned the Torres family's strategy against them. Our counter motion included the hospital security footage, financial records showing Torres Construction's insolvency, testimony from medical staff, and the recorded conversation from the previous evening where Richard had constructed his elaborate fiction. The criminal complaints were equally comprehensive, charging Richard, Victoria, and Dr. Hartwell with fraud, elder abuse, financial exploitation, and conspiracy. The medical directive provisions supported additional charges related to endangerment and potential attempted murder. The Torres family's response was swift and predictable. Victoria called within hours of being served with the criminal complaints, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Amanda, I don't know what kind of attorneys you've involved, but they're clearly taking advantage of your medical situation to create unnecessary legal complications," she said. "This kind of family conflict will destroy all of our reputations and accomplish nothing positive." The irony of Victoria accusing my attorneys of taking advantage of my medical situation, while she and her family had literally stolen my assets while I was unconscious, was so obvious that I almost laughed. "I'm sorry you feel that way," I replied calmly. I'm simply trying to understand what happened during my hospitalization and ensure that proper procedures were followed. This isn't the way family resolves disagreements, Victoria continued. Involving criminal attorneys and making wild accusations will only hurt everyone involved. What would you suggest instead? I asked. There was a pause before Victoria responded, and I could hear the calculation in her voice. Meet with us tonight. All of us, including Dr. Hartwell. Let us explain everything properly and resolve this misunderstanding before it goes any further. The request for a family meeting was exactly what Grace had predicted. Faced with serious criminal charges and comprehensive evidence of their scheme, the Torres family wanted to negotiate a private resolution that would avoid public exposure and potential prison sentences. I'll consider it, I said, but any meeting would need to include my attorney as well. Victoria's reluctance to include Grace in their family meeting was telling, but she eventually agreed to a formal conference at Dr. Hartwell's office that evening. The meeting at Hartwell's downtown Phoenix law firm felt like a corporate summit more than a family discussion. The conference room was intimidating by design, with dark wood paneling and formal portraits that projected legal authority and professional gravitas. The Torres family arrived together, presenting a united front that might have impressed me once upon a time. Victoria wore her most expensive suit and carried herself with the regal bearing she reserved for serious business negotiations. Richard looked haggard but determined, while Patricia seemed uncomfortable with the entire proceeding. Dr. Hartwell was exactly what I'd expected from the Torres family attorney. Silver-haired, expensively dressed, and radiating the kind of legal authority that had probably intimidated countless opponents over his decades of practice. Grace entered the room like a force of nature, carrying 3 thick file folders and an expression of professional competence that immediately shifted the power dynamic. She wasn't intimidated by Hartwell's reputation or the Torres family's coordinated presentation, and her confidence was contagious. Before we begin, Grace announced, I want to establish that this meeting is being recorded and that anything said here can and will be used in ongoing criminal proceedings unless a comprehensive resolution is reached tonight. The opening. Salvo established the stakes clearly. This wasn't a family mediation or friendly negotiation. It was a final opportunity for the Torres family to avoid prosecution by completely undoing their theft and accepting responsibility for their actions. Dr. Hartwell attempted to control the narrative by presenting his version of events first, describing the hospital documentation as routine medical authorizations that had been handled with proper legal oversight and Amanda's full consent. But Grace was ready for this approach. She systematically dismantled each of Hartwell's explanations using the evidence we'd gathered, presenting hospital security footage, financial records, and witness testimony that exposed the coordinated nature of their scheme. Your clients didn't just take advantage of Mrs. Torres during a medical crisis, Grace said, spreading photographs across the conference table. They orchestrated a systematic theft of her assets while she was unconscious and vulnerable, creating false business justifications and fraudulent loan agreements to legitimize their actions. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Security. Footage showing Richard and Hartwell entering my hospital room during periods of heavy sedation. Financial records proving that Torres Construction had no legitimate loan requiring my assets as collateral. Medical testimony about the timing of additional pain medication before document signings. But the most damaging evidence was the recorded conversation from the previous evening, where Richard had constructed an elaborate fiction about my supposed agreement to help with business financing. If Mrs. Torres had actually agreed to these arrangements as your clients claim, Grace continued, why did Mr. Torres find it necessary to fabricate detailed conversations and emotional justifications that never occurred? As Grace methodically presented our case, I watched the Torres family's confidence crumble. Victoria's regal composure gave way to obvious anxiety, while Richard seemed to shrink into his chair with each new piece of evidence. Dr. Hartwell made several attempts to challenge the admissibility or interpretation of our evidence, but Grace's Preparation was thorough and professional. Every document was properly authenticated, every witness statement was sworn and notarized, and every piece of financial evidence was supported by independent verification. The turning point came when Grace played the recording of Richard's dinner conversation from the previous evening. Hearing his voice constructing detailed lies about conversations that had never happened, while sitting across from the woman he'd tried to defraud, was devastating to any remaining credibility. "Mr. Torres," Grace said after the recording concluded, "you've just heard yourself fabricating an elaborate story about your wife's supposed agreement to arrangements that our evidence proves never occurred. Would you like to explain how someone who genuinely believed in the legitimacy of these documents would find it necessary to construct fictional justifications?" Richard had no answer. The recording was clear evidence of deception, and combined with all the other documentation, it painted an undeniable picture of systematic fraud and manipulation. Victoria attempted to salvage the situation by suggesting that misunderstandings and communication failures had created an unfortunate situation that could be resolved through good faith negotiations. But Grace wasn't interested in face-saving explanations. "Mrs. Torres is prepared to accept a complete restoration of her assets, dissolution of all fraudulent agreements, and formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing in exchange for not pursuing criminal prosecution," Grace announced. "This offer expires at midnight tonight." The ultimatum hung in the air like a sword over the entire Torres family. Criminal prosecution would mean public exposure, potential prison sentences, and the complete destruction of their business reputation. But acknowledging wrongdoing would require admitting to systematic fraud and theft. Dr. Hartwell requested a private consultation with his clients, and Grace and I stepped out of the conference room to allow them to discuss their options. Through the glass walls, we could see animated conversations and obvious disagreement among the family members. When we returned 30 minutes later, the Torres family had reached their decision. Victoria spoke for the group with the defeated tone of someone who'd been outmaneuvered completely. "We're prepared to accept your terms," she said. "Complete restoration of Amanda's assets, dissolution of all contested agreements, and a private acknowledgement of improper handling of the hospital documentation." Grace shook her head firmly. "The acknowledgement must be formal and written, not private. Mrs. Torres requires documentation that these arrangements were obtained without her informed consent and contained provisions that were not in her best interest." The negotiation continued for another hour, with Grace systematically extracting concessions that would protect me from any future claims while ensuring that the Torres family acknowledged the illegitimate nature of their actions. The final agreement was comprehensive and unforgiving. Complete restoration of my Morrison marketing ownership with no residual claims from Torres Construction. Dissolution of the medical directive and power of attorney with written confirmation that they were obtained through improper means. A formal acknowledgement that Torres Construction had created fraudulent loan documents to justify the asset transfer. Most importantly, the agreement included provisions that would prevent the Torres family from ever again claiming any authority over my medical or financial affairs, with substantial financial penalties for any future attempts at manipulation or coercion. As Dr. Hartwell drafted the formal agreements, I felt a strange sense of closure. The people who had tried to steal my assets while I was fighting for my life were now facing the consequences of their actions, forced to acknowledge their wrongdoing and restore what they had taken. But more than that, I had discovered something about myself that 8 years of marriage had obscured. I was capable of strategic thinking, aggressive advocacy, and systematic problem-solving when my core interests were threatened. The Torres family had unwittingly revealed strengths I hadn't known I possessed. 6 months later, I stood in my new office in Scottsdale, looking out at the desert landscape that had become synonymous with my complete transformation. Morrison Marketing's Phoenix branch had thrived under my renewed leadership, expanding into new markets and developing innovative strategies that had attracted national attention. The divorce from Richard had been finalized with minimal drama, both parties eager to end their legal entanglement as quickly as possible. I'd kept the house in Paradise Valley briefly before selling it and using the proceeds to purchase a modern downtown condo that reflected my new independence rather than Torres family expectations. Torres Construction had struggled to recover from the financial and reputational damage of their failed scheme. The Henderson project had collapsed when their financing fell through, and several other clients had terminated contracts after learning about the legal proceedings. Richard had left Phoenix entirely, reportedly working for a construction firm in Denver, where his family connections carried less weight. Victoria had retreated from public life, her social standing permanently damaged by the revelation of her role in orchestrating theft from her own daughter-in-law during a medical crisis. Patricia had reached out several times, attempting to rebuild our relationship, but I'd decided that some bridges were better left permanently burned. The most satisfying aspect of my transformation wasn't the financial recovery or professional success, though both were gratifying. It was the recognition that I'd spent 8 years diminishing myself to fit into a family that had never valued my contributions or respected my intelligence. My heart attack had nearly killed me, but it had also saved me from a life of managed mediocrity and systematic exploitation. The Torres family had tried to use my vulnerability as an opportunity for theft, but instead they'd awakened a strength and determination that had been dormant for far too long. Dr. Sullivan had been right about eliminating stress from my life being crucial for cardiac recovery. Removing the Torres family from my daily existence had been the most effective medical intervention possible, better than any medication or lifestyle change. As I prepared to leave my office that evening, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that night at the Copper Crown when chest pain had interrupted our anniversary dinner. The woman who had collapsed in that parking lot had been Amanda Torres, dutiful wife and overlooked family member. The woman walking out of this Scottsdale office was Amanda Martinez, having reclaimed my maiden name along with my independence. I was a successful business owner, a strategic thinker, and someone who understood that loyalty must be mutual to have any meaning. My phone buzzed with a text from Nicole Thompson, my college friend who had helped me navigate the initial legal complexities. Dinner this weekend to celebrate the Morrison marketing expansion? I'm buying. I smiled, remembering how isolated I'd become during my marriage, how the Torres family had gradually separated me from relationships that might have provided alternative perspectives on their treatment of me. Now I had friends again, professional, relationships based on mutual respect and the confidence that comes from having survived a systematic attempt to destroy your life and emerging stronger than before. The heart attack that had nearly killed me at 34 had actually been the beginning of my real life. Everything before that night in the restaurant parking lot felt like prologue to the woman I'd become through surviving betrayal, theft, and attempted exploitation by people who were supposed to love and protect me. As I drove home through Phoenix, traffic, I thought about the single piece of paper I'd signed that had changed everything. Not the fraudulent documents the Torres family had used to steal my assets, but the retainer agreement with Grace Williams that had made my legal counterattack possible. That signature had been the moment I'd stopped being a victim and started being a strategist. The moment I'd realized that fighting back was not only possible, but necessary for my survival and dignity. The Torres family had made one crucial miscalculation in their scheme. They'd assumed that 8 years of marriage had transformed me into someone who would accept their explanations and submit to their management, rather than seek independent verification and professional advocacy. They'd forgotten that underneath the compliant wife they'd helped create was the ambitious marketing executive who had negotiated million-dollar contracts and built successful business relationships across multiple states. That woman had never really disappeared. She'd just been waiting for the right moment to remind everyone, including herself, exactly what she was capable of when pushed too far by people who had mistaken her loyalty for weakness. Up next, you've got 2 more stand out stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.